Over 200 years ago, Chatsworth was at the centre of plant collecting. And the most highly prized of those were orchids. Chatsworth has been home to the Cavendish family for over 500 years, and they're a family of collectors. Each generation has collected art, books, sculpture, furniture, jewellery and plants. I'm Faye, and I've worked in botanic and historic gardens for over 15 years. I'm passionate about orchids. You can see from our archives and our glasshouses that Chatsworth collection of orchids still thrives today, thanks to the expertise of the Victorians who first brought them here. The 6th Duke of Devonshire, William Spencer Cavendish, was an avid collector. He collected art, sculpture and books, but he was really passionate about plants. And in 1821, where our story really begins, he leased a portion of his land at Chiswick to the Horticultural Society, which is now the Royal Horticultural Society, so that they could hold shows and fetes and to have a garden. And it was at one of these shows that the Duke saw one orchid, the butterfly orchid, Psychopsis papilio, and he was entranced by its beauty, its elegance and its exoticness. And there and then, on the spot, he paid £100 for a single plant. And that's about £10,000 in today's money. Later on, in 1838, the Duke himself then became president of the Horticultural Society and remained so for 20 years. Beginning with that one plant, the Duke then became really passionate about orchids. When he heard that a large collection was for sale, he sent his head gardener Joseph Paxton to assess them. Whilst he identified many new orchids and in good condition, he thought the £500 being asked for was too much money. Still, the Duke was convinced it was too good an opportunity to miss and paid the £500, and they were both delighted with their new plants and their expanded collection. By 1836, the Duke had over 300 species of orchids, but to keep up with the competition, he had to have more. The Duke was persuaded to send somebody to India to collect plants. Joseph Paxton suggested 19-year-old John Gibson, who was a gardener at Chatsworth. Gibson travelled by boat and by foot to the Kosir Hills in northwest India. He sent back thousands of plants, including hundreds of orchids, some of which were new to cultivation and were named for the family and for Paxton. At the time, it was common for wealthy plant collectors and nurseries to send individuals to travel abroad in order to collect plants from the wild. Indeed, many of the plants that are widely grown in Britain today will originally have been introduced to Europe in this way. Today we understand the importance of plants in their wild habitats, and there are strict laws and protocols surrounding the collection and importation of wild plants. Many, including orchids, are specifically protected due to the endangered state of their wild populations. This greenhouse that we're stood in is now known as Paxton's glasshouse. It dates from around 1834 or 1835, and it stayed in use as an orchid house up until 1920, when Chatsworth went through a lot of changes, particularly the glasshouses. It was divided into 3 separate sections, probably to house the 3 different growing conditions and different temperatures. And this fits really nicely with what Paxton himself had written about best ways in which to grow orchids. He actually wrote extensively about this, and he was one of the first people to really suggest growing orchids in this way, which actually are the same designations that we use today when we're growing orchids. We still grow them as either cool, intermediate or warm growing. This is a quote that Joseph Paxton wrote in an article specifically about the care of orchids, which he wrote for his magazine of botany in 1836. He calls it "A few hints on the management of orchideous epiphytes with a selection of the choicest kinds at present in cultivation." And that's just the title. And he says, to quote, "It is advisable for every cultivator, as much as possible, to learn the native habits and situation of each separate species, in order to ensure its successful management." So what he's suggesting here is to really study the environment which these plants originally grow, which was a concept seemingly quite new at the time, But of course we look at that now as being the real standard for how we learn to grow plants. Do they grow in the mountains? Do they grow in the jungle? Do they grow in the forest? Do they grow on deserts? We need to think about that before we can actually provide the plants with the perfect conditions that they need. Chatsworth has welcomed visitors and guests for many centuries. Orchids were once grown in a huge glasshouse that was big enough to drive a carriage through. This is the site of the Great Conservatory. The Great Conservatory was also open to visitors. Up to 50,000 people a year used to visit. All that remains now are these stone walls. And the orchids were planted amongst the other plants as if they were growing in their natural habitat. You may have heard of Crystal Palace in London. Now that glasshouse was based on the design of the Great Conservatory here. This glasshouse isn't open to the public, so we're really excited to share it with you today. And I really want to show you this orchid. This is Coelogene cristata Chatsworth, and it's one of the species that Gibson collected and would have been grown by Paxton. Now this orchid is a cool growing orchid and is still widely grown today by orchid growers. It's fairly easy to grow and it makes really good specimens and often still wins awards. We grow a wide variety of orchids here that need different conditions. This is a Peony Tongariro, and this needs cool growing conditions. It has these swollen bulb type parts of the plant at the bottom, which are not bulbs, they're called pseudobulbs, so they are a storage part of the plant. One of the reasons that John Gibson had so much success bringing plants back on his voyage was that he used a new form of case called a Wardian case. It acted very, very similarly to how this terrarium does. It's like a miniature greenhouse. It's a sealed container, and basically the moisture that the plants evaporate through their leaves then collects on the side of the glass and condensates and runs down and waters the plant. The Wardian cases were very similar, and they did a fantastic job of protecting the plants on the long voyages and getting them safely back to Chatsworth. These are warm growing orchids. These are Calanthe vestita hybrids, and these were hugely popular in the Victorian era. Now, they don't look like a huge amount now, but in the winter they'll be absolutely full of beautiful white and pink flowers. This is also a pseudobulb, so this is where the plant regrows every year. It's deciduous, so it dies back down and has a dormant period. And then in the spring, it sends up a new shoot, which becomes the plant for the year, and then that'll die down at the end of the year in about November, and then they'll flower for about 6 weeks, so over the Christmas period, which would have been fantastically useful in a Victorian house or in a house that you wanted to decorate through Christmas. This is Coelogene tomentosa, which is also known as Massangeana, and this is an intermediate growing species. And even though the flowers aren't very colourful, I think they're really quite beautiful and very dainty. Now this is what you think of when you think about an orchid, a large flower and brightly coloured. This, I believe, is an Odontoglossum hybrid, but this is the first time I've seen these plants in flower in the greenhouse, and unfortunately it's lost its label, so like a lot of the other plants, I'm trying to identify them as they flower. Hopefully with a bit of help we'll work out what this one is. The 12th Duke and Duchess are passionate about this garden too. And even though we don't still have the orchid glasshouses that used to be here, we do still grow some orchids. And based on the principles that Joseph Paxton wrote about after Gibson's travels. The orchids are grown in 3 different temperature and humidity zones, which grows them to their best advantage, replicating the natural environment in which they grow in. Orchids are just as popular today as they were in the Victorian heyday of the Orchidelirium.